In this video, I want to simplify this trig expression. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply this product here and then simplify it as best as we can from there. So first, let's FOIL or distribute these two binomials in the numerator. So sine of theta times the sine of theta, that's sine squared theta. Sine of theta times the cosine of theta, that's exactly that. Cosine of theta times the sine of theta, again, we end up with another sine of theta, cosine of theta term. And then cosine times the cosine is cosine squared theta. And then all of that is minus 1. And then all of this is over sine of theta, cosine of theta. Sine of theta times the cosine of theta. Combine any like terms that we can. So we have this term here and this term here that we can put together to make 2 sine of theta, cosine of theta. So we have 2 sine of theta times the cosine of theta. And then we have plus sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta minus 1. And then all of this divided by sine of theta times the cosine of theta. Whoops, times cosine of theta. Now we know that sine squared plus cosine squared, this is just 1. So we can substitute 1 in there. So we have 2 sine of theta plus, times cosine of theta plus 1 minus 1, all divided by sine of theta times the cosine of theta. These two, when we combine them, are just going to cancel each other out. And then we're left with 2 sine of theta times the cosine of theta divided by sine of theta times the cosine of theta. And the sines will reduce to be a 1, and the cosines will reduce to be a 1, which really, overall, just leaves us with 2. So this whole thing up here all just simplifies to be 2. So it's kind of crazy. We do all this work to get just the number 2. Let's take a look at another example. So for this example, we want to factor and then simplify. So we can factor the numerator. The numerator is really just a difference of squares. So if you think of the numerator in terms of like x squared minus 1, we know that a difference of squares factors into conjugates. So the same is going to happen with the numerator in this problem. So it's going to factor to be cosine of theta minus 1 times the quantity cosine of theta plus 1. And then in the denominator, our cosine squared theta and negative cosine of theta have a common factor. So we can factor out that common factor of cosine of theta. So factor that out, and then we have cosine of theta minus 1. And now we can see that we have a common factor in the numerator and denominator. So we have cosine of theta minus 1. That will cancel with that cosine of theta minus 1 there. So now we're left with cosine of theta plus 1 all over the cosine of theta. We can simplify this a little bit more. So we can break this into 2 different fractions with a common denominator. So the first one is going to be cosine of theta divided by the cosine of theta. And that's going to be added to 1 over the cosine of theta. We know that cosine of theta divided by cosine of theta is just 1. And then 1 over the cosine of theta is the secant of theta. So this whole thing simplified to be just 1 plus the secant of theta.